But I kind of had this moment reading a great work of history, of World War II history, which is called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer, who was a journalist in Europe at the time. And he kind of mentions casually in this footnote that on the eve of World War II, right before Germany invaded Poland, or actually right after, the New York Times printed the opposite. They printed that Poland had attacked Germany. And that sort of flies in the face of like all the fundamentals we know about the Nazi campaign to take over Europe, that they were obviously not defending themselves. Hitler was trying to conquer the continent and then the rest of the world. And I thought to myself, how could the New York Times, this great institution of journalism, sterling credibility, have printed such a thing? Number one, is that even possible? And number two, if it is possible, how did it happen? So I went and looked at the archive, and sure enough, that is what they printed that day in 1939, that Polish guerrilla fighters had attacked this German radio station, and they printed Hitler's speech, quote unquote, responding to the aggression and giving Germany justification for its attack on Poland. And what I discovered from looking into that incident was that it was a Nazi propaganda blitz. And the New York Times bought it hook, line, and sinker, and they sold it to the American public by printing it. And when I went back and looked at that article that they printed that day, it was the lead article, I believe it was September 1st, 1939. They offered no response from the Polish side. There was no third party commentating on what was going on. And we have to keep in mind, this was after 10 years of Nazi aggression, 10 years of Nazi propaganda, 10 years of anti-Semitism and persecution of minorities. And the New York Times just kind of took it at face value. And that's where I set off saying, there's got to be more to this. This can't just be an isolated incident. It's too big. It's too extreme. And I went out and started doing the research that led to the rest of the Gray Lady Wing.
You know what I noticed from this, because I was looking up that headline, and yeah, it was September 1st. And what I noticed is it's something that I still see a lot today, which is the story was really about someone else's account of something that had happened, and it wasn't really about, it seemed like to me, now this, I didn't read the entire thing, you see this a lot today, the news story is what someone else said happened, and it's not actually the story of what happened. And I wonder if that's a way that they try to get around the truth, because this is truthfully what someone said happened. In this case, it was what Hitler said happened with Poland invading Germany. Is that something that they use to skirt the truth? Because it was factually accurate that Hitler said this, but it might not have been factually accurate that that's what actually happened.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. You actually really put your finger on it in that case, because what they were not saying, they didn't come out and offer a journalistic account saying exactly as you've identified that Poland had indeed attacked Germany. What they did was they used that little mechanism to say, according to a semi-official German news agency, by which they mean a Nazi propaganda organ, because there was no such thing as a semi-official news agency at that time. It was all controlled by the regime. So they used that as cover to print this falsehood. And yes, absolutely, that is a tactic, because the New York Times is, for all of its foibles, for all of its huge flaws, it's very, very sophisticated. These guys are not going to be the type that are going to just bluntly offer the bald-faced lie. They're going to be smart enough, the journalists who were committing these acts of malfeasance, to do something like that, which is to say, using a source that kind of is a gray area, and gives a kind of double meaning to the word gray in the Gray Lady, which is the famous moniker of the New York Times. It used to be called the Gray Lady because the reporting was very dry. It was very middle of the road, straight down the middle, and very sober-minded. The tone was very kind of along those lines as well. But really, when you think about gray in this context, it's more like they're kind of playing in the shades of gray there, not giving you the truth, not giving you the full falsehood either, but acting in the middle. There are exceptions to that. And, Walter Duranty was another is a really good example where he's in chapter 2 of the book, where he just outright denied that there was a famine occurring in Ukraine in 1932 and 1933. He just hit it on the head, saying, nope, didn't happen. There was no shades of gray in that case, for different reasons. But, so often it is the case that they use that gray area to play in. And I'd say definitely more often than not, but there are also exceptions to that rule.
Well, the famine is a really interesting topic also, because there's still discrepancies on how many people died in that famine, and we talk a lot about the kulaks, the dekulakization, things like that, and obviously this is something that everyone's going to ask you about, and I know you answer all the time. But I guess we'll dive right into that. You have a paper that is running cover when it comes to Hitler invading Poland. You have a paper that is running cover when it comes to people dying in a famine. And of course, the question is always going to be why? What is the incentive for them to do this?
Yeah, that's exactly the question. I mean, that's the question at the core of the whole thing, is to say, and when I say the whole thing, not just my book, which is on a smaller level, but of this great institution, this great American institution that so many people have placed their credibility, their trust in, to lend them this kind of credibility. Why would they betray all that trust? Why would they do these things that are just out and out wrong? Like, going back to our first case of World War II, the story behind that was that they had a Berlin bureau chief at the time, the guy who was running the show for the reporting out of Germany, who was a Nazi collaborator. He was working with the Nazis. He was publishing stuff that was so favorable to them that they were reading his articles on Nazi propaganda broadcasts. They wanted their people to know this stuff. So the New York Times owners knew about this guy. His name was Guido Inderis. He was a known Nazi sympathizer. I call him a collaborator because he actively acted on his Nazi sympathies. And the reason they never removed him from that position was because he brought home the goods. He got great scoops. He got good stories because he had the best access to Nazi sources because they loved him. And for the New York Times owners at home, the management at home, this was business. This was about being number one. And being number one when you're a newspaper in the heyday of newspapers, that's money, that's power, that's prestige, that's status. That's all the things that every big business wants, and especially every big business owned and operated and controlled by a very small number of people, which is exactly what the case is with the New York Times. They're a single family owning this enormous institution that is, it's a $10 billion company, the New York Times company. It's a fairly big company, certainly by the standard of a family-controlled operation. But even more so, their power is just huge. It's way beyond anything that a comparable $10 billion company in a different industry would have. These guys are able to shape our reality. They edit our reality. And when you look at the through line of all these different instances, it's when the New York Times' owners, or the owning family, the controlling family of the New York Times company, got involved with the story, that things got really scrambled. And that's what we see over and over when business interests of this company, which is very much a big media, big news company, just as we have big pharma and big ag and other forms of big business. This is big media. And when that element comes to bear, which it often does, that's when things go sideways. Again, money and power put in front of the truth. That is a very dangerous equation.
I did a lot of research and listening to things that you've said when you were talking about this, and I wanted to point out to the people listening that I don't take you as someone who just has this vendetta to try and destroy the New York Times because you hate them personally for some reason. What I actually see is that you're someone who cares a lot about the meaning and the truth, and that the New York Times is really just a representation of this falsehood and of propaganda and all the things that can go wrong when you have that money and power. Would you say that that's accurate?
Yeah, very much so. I think there's sort of two levels. I think about this in a personal sense. One is that, there are a lot of great journalists out there, a lot of hardworking reporters doing their jobs. They are not getting paid as much as they would in other industries. Sometimes they're taking real personal risks to themselves or their families, but they're doing it for a cause. And many of those people work at the New York Times. So there's this distinction between the reporters and the journalists who are doing the work and the family that's controlling, or in other cases, the shareholders or the board controlling these big media organizations. And that's the other level that I think about this on, which is that I think we're at a crisis point with regard to media, and especially in the news, where public trust in the media is at an all-time low. And that's a very alarming trend. And it's something that we need to nip in the bud. And we can't do it by saying, hey, public, guys, wake up. You should have more trust in the media. Obviously, that's not going to work. What needs to happen is the media to step back, look at itself the way that it looks at other industries, the way it has shined a spotlight on pharma, on agriculture, on the chemicals industries, on the healthcare industry. They've never done it with themselves. The storylines that you read about the media in the media are about financial hardships, and another newspaper had to lay off this many reporters and that many reporters. It's kind of a sob story. No one has turned the light on the media itself and said, hey, wait, we have a big media problem. We have billions of dollars of interest and influence that is actually affecting the way we do our job, the way this business is structured, and our customers, the people we're serving, don't like it anymore. We need to think about change. And I think that's the conversation I really hope this book prompts us to ask news consumers themselves, readers, to say, how can I start to make this change on my own?
Do you think it's possible for people at these big organizations, because they're being ran by human beings? I mean, we've all got biases, right? A little bit. And there's a little bit that I try to, obviously, on this show, we don't talk from our biases. We just speak about the truth. Of course, that's all we talk about. But maybe I am doing things that I don't realize that I'm doing, and it just comes naturally to me. So when you have this big organization, is it actually possible to write about these stories and not manipulate or show just one side of the story? Do you think it's actually possible to do this?
I do think it is possible. I think it's hard. I think it's very hard. But I think if you're creating a system that's built to do it, then you are going to do a better job than if you're not trying to do it. And if you're just embracing the bias and doubling down on it, the way CNN has declared in recent months that we're going even harder on the opinion, we're going even harder on the partisanship, and you're saying, well, good for you. That might do your ratings well for a week or two or a month or two. But look what's happened at CNN as a great example in the last few months. It's like someone's like pulled the plug on their audience, and their audience is just fleeing. Like there's just once Donald Trump was no longer president, they could not sustain that approach to the news. And I think from a business point of view, that's a big problem. But I think from an even greater sort of public institution role that the media plays and is supposed to play, they have to try harder to create balance, number one. But I think even beyond that, because bias is okay. I mean, it's like you're saying, it's kind of natural to human existence. Like we're just looking out for our own interests and we have an agenda. Okay, no problem. What we're seeing with the New York Times in the book was that this was not just bias. These are lies. Mm. And these were lies that were predicated on looking at the truth as a weapon. And that's what you see from Guido Enderis in Nazi Germany saying, you know what, I think I'm just going to tell it the Nazi way. And the New York Times owners, maybe Guido Enderis actually thought he was doing a good thing. I don't think he was. But when the New York Times owners saw that this was going on, it was brought to their attention, and the response was to threaten the whistleblower with a lawsuit. Now you've got a real problem, because that's no longer about bias. That's about putting your own interests above the truth.
Yeah, I wonder a lot when we look back at what they did with the Nazi propaganda. I think one thing that we do wrong is we look at it through 2021 lens, and we say something like, well, there's no way that the New York Times would have been printing any kind of Nazi propaganda. But that's looking from right now. If you put yourself in the standpoint of, I know in 1939, there's still a lot of really bad things going on. But at that time, I wonder if it was still based out of this anti-individualist, anti-capitalist, anti any of those things, where the Nazis were really still they were a socialist party, and then they also, you see them run cover for Stalin as well. I'm assuming there's plenty of stories about Cuba and Venezuela and all of that throughout time. And I wonder if they really were just lumped in with this pro-collectivism mindset, with this pro socialist mindset, maybe. And we look back at it right now and say there's no way that happened, but that's looking through our lens.
Yeah, that's a great point. I actually never really thought of it along those lines of pro-collectivism per se, and it's a really good sort of axis to think about this on. That might be true. I do think sort of maybe the other side of that coin, which is something that's almost anti-American. When you say, okay, well, what else did all these regimes have in common? They were all actively opposed to American power and influence in the world. And the New York Times was very sympathetic in its actions, at least, to, as we've seen, the Nazis. With the Nazi stuff, we've spoken about one incident. There's just endless number of cases that span that decade, from, let's say, the early 30s to the early 40s, that include them being very, very supportive of the Munich Accords, which really handed the Germans even more diplomatic cover. They called the Berlin Olympics, the Nazi Olympics, the greatest sporting event of all time. That was the headline. And the article was even worse than the headline. The article was just a celebration of this Nazi propaganda event, again and again and again. So I look back and I think there is this anti-Americanism that runs through all this kind of fallacious reporting, whether it's pro-Cuba, pro-Fidel, or even the 1619 Project, which is the most recent case, where the New York Times came out saying, actually, America was not founded in liberty in 1776. It was founded in slavery in 1619, when the first slaves reached the colonies. Sorry, America, all that great stuff you told yourself about your country, not true. The exact opposite is true. And that's an interesting case also in reference to our earlier talk about grayness, because that's very black and white. They're not giving room there to say, yeah, okay, America has this very dark history and we are not done with it. It's still part of our lives. They're not saying it's a nuanced case. They're saying, this is all or nothing. This is a slavocracy, and we're still just kind of inhabiting its remnants. So, but at the end of the day, that's not a pro-American message, I would say. I would say that is quite an anti-American message.
That really still goes to the idea of a lot of their incentives to just be anti-America, because when you tell people that America started in 1619 and is just rooted in slavery, and then you think about every single part of the country, you think about now we know you talk about the founding fathers, you're just talking about a bunch of racist slaveholders, right? So why do I care about a quote from Thomas Jefferson or a quote from Benjamin Franklin? These are just a bunch of slaveholding, terrible people. Obviously, those were terrible things going on, but this really changes our society, right? You end up with a very large group of people that no longer believe in, or no longer, I guess, respect the ideas that America was really founded on, because now it's slavery. Now it's not individual liberty.
Yeah, 100%. It's a real subversion of values, and to use a Nietzschean term, where you are saying this narrative we've all told ourselves since the founding of the country, it was completely false. And they actually use those exact words that I just said. Like, that's almost a verbatim quote from the 1619 Project itself. What they are trying to achieve there is what they called a reframing of the narrative, a reframing of American history in terms of different kinds of values. And, I think from the point of view of an African-American person, I could probably put myself in their shoes. I mean, obviously, I don't know what it's like to walk around in America as an African-American person, but I could say, okay, I could look back on a history like that and be like, why would I ever want to endorse this? However, I think the real problem with the 1619 Project was that they were selling falsehoods. The core claims that it makes are historically unsupportable. And that's where things go really wrong, because they're willing to make those claims anyway. Their own fact checkers, these are professors at really prestigious universities, came to them and said, these things are not true. Don't publish them. And they published them anyway. And what that says to me is that they were willing to do whatever it takes in order to sell this narrative, whether it's about the truth or not. That's not the concern. The concern was always about the narrative and always about power. And when, again, this to me is the core problem here, is when you're putting power in front of the truth, the power before the truth, you've got a problem. And the other twist here with the 1619 Project is that they have openly acknowledged, the New York Times has openly acknowledged that this is a very big part of their marketing stack for the next few years. They're looking at younger, more woke millennial audiences, and they know that they need to engage them on these issues in order to make them into subscribers. And they use the 1619 Project as a centerpiece of that marketing effort. And that's where the money comes back into play.
And another big problem is that we have, let's say they came out and they said, well, when we say 1619, it was founded, what we're really saying is, what if it was founded in 1619? We're not saying it was, we're just writing as if this were the case. We didn't mean that it actually was founded in 1619. I think some things like that were said at some time. But the problem is, once you've made this impression on people, once you've got the narrative out there, it's really hard to ever take away that impression afterwards, because it's like you've opened that part in people's minds and you've opened this door, and how do you ever get that back?
Yeah, and sometimes that does happen, where an incredibly false claim, just flat out false, like during the Capitol Hill riots, where an officer died afterwards, and the New York Times had published for weeks and weeks and weeks that he was killed. They use the word killed.
Oh, you still can't say that he actually died of a stroke afterwards. You can't. He was hit in the head by a fire extinguisher, and that's what happened. He was killed there, right? That's what you're talking about, right?
That's what I'm talking about, Officer Sicknick. And the medical evidence is very clear. He died of a stroke. And the stroke there was no connection that they were able to draw between stroke and being hit in the head. But once the impression is made, as you're saying, it's there. It's in our minds. It changes the framing of the entire story, and they're never going to go back and write the next 12 articles to counter the first 12 saying, oh, actually the coroner said this. Oh, actually the autopsy showed this. Oh, actually blah, blah, blah. That never happens. And what we have is this kind of artifact in our minds about what we believe to be the truth, and even on a subconscious level. With the 1619 Project, though, it's a bit of a different case, because they're not only kind of letting the falsehoods remain, they're actively leaning into this by putting this framework into school curricula, turning it into podcasts, into series with I forget who's the partner, Netflix or Oprah, whoever it is, or both, and really leaning into that foundational notion that this country was founded in slavery, whether or not 1619 was the date, whether or not we still want to call Abraham Lincoln a racist, as they did in the first issue of the 1619 Project. Those are all become trivial details. And that's the real point here, is that what we consider to be the essence of history, which is the hard facts, the assertions, the claims, for them are just kind of little pivot points that you're using to build out the bigger narrative. And what really matters is the bigger narrative.
And what do you think that bigger narrative is? Is it the anti-American narrative? Is that what they're working towards? Is this all just to subvert any type of respect or love for the country to someday take it down? I mean, obviously this is speculation. We don't know.
I think it's a lever in this case. It's a lever for power, as it always is. I think the lever here is for political power, to say, hey, all you millions of people out there quaintly believing that this country was built in liberty and that you're living in a land of liberty, wrong. You're living in a country built in slavery, and you better get working to fix it. And if you're not fixing it, you're part of the problem. That's what this sort of message we hear from critical race theory, which is that you think you're neutral just because you're not involved. That's wrong. If you are not working towards our ends, our ideological ends, then you're a racist. And the 1619 Project is sort of doing the same thing, saying we've got this America that you see today. You look out your window, see America. That's all kind of this like slaveocracy or the remnants of a slaveocracy. And in order to make this ongoing injustice right, we all need to get involved. We all need to get in line with the New York Times' ideological goals and critical race theories' ideological goals. And you all got to get working. You all got to get voting for our candidates, donating to our causes. So this becomes a political lever. And that's very clear in my mind that that's the case. And it's a great motivator to say, like, you're basically a slave owner. You and me on this phone calls, we're basically enjoying the fruits of slavery. So we better find a way to make that right.
Another thing I wanted to mention when we were talking about some of these ridiculous things that turned out to not be true when it comes to Trump, but I wasn't a big Trump supporter, didn't vote for the guy, just so you know. But from what I heard after the Charlottesville thing, he refused to condemn white supremacy, right? He would not do it. Mm-hmm. Now, this is one of those things where that is a narrative that almost anyone that reads anything on the left would tell you. But actually, if you watched, say, 30 seconds further into his speech, when he says that white supremacy should be condemned and that he wasn't talking about the Nazis that were there at the protest, this is just another great example of something that you can't erase from people's minds. People will still say he refuses to condemn white supremacists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with Trump, that was a particularly egregious example because they were so committed to opposing Trump that there was this big explosion of outrage at the New York Times within its own ranks when they published a headline that said something about a Trump speech being saying that America needs to choose between unity and hate, and that maybe the speech was about that, maybe it wasn't about that, but it really sparked this like revulsion at the New York Times and also among people in the culture surrounding it, involved with it. They could not tolerate the idea that he might have said something that they could agree with. And that's just the extreme polarization at work. And again, that serves them, very much serves them, because this is an institution that is read by millions and millions of people, most of whom don't pay for that. Only 2 or 3% of their audience is actually paying them through subscriptions. Their advertising doesn't really, it's on the decline. They know that subscriptions are their future. And when you're catering to a base of 2%, you are, by virtue of that structure, going to polarize your content. And that's exactly what's happened. They've accused, the New York Times and other parts of the media have accused of tech doing that through algorithms. And that's probably true. Facebook, the algorithm is, as we all know, is optimized to serve you content that is polarized and polarizing because it makes money. And the thing that we've all missed is that the media has been doing exactly this forever, basically. And now they're doing it more than they've done it in the past. As what I was talking about with CNN is that they are doubling down on that model. They're not saying, let's move to the middle, because there's no money in the middle. There's no political power in the middle. It's in the margins that's happening. And that's where we end up with things like the Officer Sicknick narrative, or the narrative about Russia bounties. The New York Times reported that Russia was paying terrorists in Afghanistan bounties to kill American soldiers, and that Trump not only knew about it, but refused to do anything about it. That was the narrative from start to finish. Turns out was that not only did Trump refuse to do anything about it, it just wasn't true at all. There were no Russian bounties. There was nothing of the sort, but it's still in our minds. And again, it doesn't pay them to go back and correct it. It doesn't pay them to go back and say, oh, actually, our reporting is not quite as foolproof, not quite as hermetically sealed as we would like to make it out to be.
I don't know if people realize how big of a deal it is in people's mindsets to think that the president, the commander-in-chief, not only racist white supremacist, but is also willing to allow U.S. service members to die and do nothing about it, and to actually be okay with that as the commander in chief, because he is so wrapped up with Russia, of course, because I'm sure New York Times and a lot of other papers were obviously pushing the entire Russian propaganda piece right after the election in 2016, and it's really, I don't know, it's it's kind of disappointing. I don't know if I really expect anything else really from a bunch of people that are going to be biased. But what do we do to actually solve this? My main thing I wonder is, does responsibility actually just lie with the readers to do their due diligence and make sure they're not being manipulated?
I think so. I think that is it's very hard to make an industry as big and powerful as the media change. It's very hard to force change on them because the culture is institutionalized there. It's a culture of now partisanship, bias, and money. So how do you separate people from those things? I think it's very hard. Unlike other industries such as ag or pharma, where you don't really have that much choice as a consumer, you're not going to refuse the cancer drug, like for some other. In this case, you actually can make choices. You can say to yourself, you know what, I'm not going to engage it anymore. I'm not going to lean back and take this kind of passive approach to news and information. I'm going to lean forward and search. This is the thing that I like to say is sort of a paradigm shift from this browsing mentality we've all had. We're like, let's just see what's on CNN or Drudge or whatever and accept it, and moving into something that's much more search. Let me go find out what actually happened. And if there isn't someone else presenting a counter narrative, let me really think hard. When they say in the Russian bounty case, the New York Times saying unnamed intelligence agencies in the United States are saying that, let me ask myself, what does that mean? What kind of sourcing is that? Is that something I would really want to rely on? An anonymous source that's not even identifying the agency, it's not identifying who that person is within the agency, could be a janitor for all we know, making a supposition, came across a piece of paper he thought meant this or meant that. But we don't know. And if you don't know, you can't accept things as fact. And I think that's where it's really incumbent upon us as individuals, as news consumers, and even, going farther than saying, let me form a group of people, let me get on Reddit and start questioning these things. Maybe I'll create a subreddit about a particular topic I want to understand better. And let's create our own version of that is rooted in fact, that is corroborated, that has multiple sources that we can rely on, do our jobs as not citizen journalists, but citizen news consumers.
Do you think that the new technologies that we have, obviously the last few years, we've seen tons of different news organizations pop up. We're all using our phones for everything now. Is this going to help solve the problem? And the other thing I wanted to ask on top of that is, how much do you think people like the New York Times and the establishment media want to discredit all of these other independent news agencies, and they want to be the arbiters of truth?
I would say to sort of answer in reverse order, they absolutely have to, in their minds, remain the arbiters of truth. And there was this sort of New York Times article about Clubhouse, the new sort of chat platform, that was accompanied, when they tweeted it out saying that Clubhouse gives people the unfettered ability to have conversations online. And you're thinking to yourself, why would it be fettered? Why would anyone need to characterize it as unfettered? What's wrong with that? And I think that is definitely a reflection of them used to being the gatekeepers, not just of the news, but of a flow of information between people. That's the media. If we didn't have someone mediating our interactions, we wouldn't be connected to one another in the past. To answer the first part of the question, digital technologies, internet technologies, and I'm guessing very much so blockchain going forward will be a part of connecting us directly as it already is, and also using that connection to create tools that enable us to do things like get together on Reddit to determine what might be the truth about the Officer Sicknick case, the Russia bounties case, going back and looking at what happened in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, retelling those stories in more accurate and authentic ways. Because I think people really want that. I think people, 99% of people want the truth. I don't think people out there are like, oh yeah, sure, just lie to me, no problem. Like I'll be fine with the lie. They really do want the truth. And I think most people are willing to sacrifice something for it, whether that's their time or their energy. They are willing, and now they are able to. And I think that's a big threat to institutions like the Times.
The other thing I wanted to talk to you about today was you have another novel coming up, right? Called is that He Falls Alone? Is that right? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. That's I write fiction as well and nonfiction, as you know. But He Falls Alone is also about that same notion of searching for the truth. I mean, the story is it was inspired by my own search for the truth when my best friend disappeared in Nicaragua around 2005-ish. And I wanted to go find out what happened. And when I was there, I kind of was inspired to tell a story different from his story, but that's about a family, like the New York Times' own family, a very powerful, wealthy family that had obscured a dark and terrible crime that this protagonist was involved in. And he goes to find out what really happened. And part of that story is looking at the huge costs that you have to bear when you want to go seek the truth. It's not easy. It's not always fun, but I think it is. I think it's the adventure that we are all a part of in today's world. I think this is the new adventure. It used to be going out to like chart a river or a tributary or something to explore the wilderness. And that's great, but we know that most of the wilderness today is charted, or we have satellite imagery. We know what things are. What we don't yet know is what's true for us. We've been cast into this very strange new reality where the truth has become very wishy-washy. But I think people are becoming intrepid. They're becoming intellectually intrepid, and they're becoming morally intrepid. And they're going out and they're doing things just like what we're doing right now, which is having the steadfastness and the courage to start a podcast, to start a website, to create a magazine, to go out there and seek. And I think that's an incredible thing.
The one thing I've always been really interested in is when it comes to getting a point across, let's say that the idea is that you need to always seek the truth and always find the truth in everything. Let's just say that that's the idea. Is it better to do that in, say, a nonfiction book about how it's important to seek the truth, or to tell a story like what you were talking about that someone is going to be able to latch on to? I liken this a lot to, let's say, Ayn Rand. I could read Atlas Shrugged, or I could read Capitalism, an Unknown Ideal, and which one is actually going to do better to change society in that direction? Do you think it's the stories, or do you think it's the actual, just I don't know what you would call that, the actual nonfiction?
I think they both serve that end in different ways. And I think in the case of nonfiction, especially if you're trying to create a theory, or a sort of trying to understand the world in a different way and put that new understanding out there, you're probably going to be doing it for a bit of a smaller audience. But the beauty of storytelling is that you can encapsulate that idea, put it in a story that is compelling, and then you've got an ability to speak to the hearts and minds of thousands or hundreds of thousands, or if you're really lucky, millions of people. And if it's an epic or an immense idea, really put it in a beautiful way, you can do that across time. And that's why storytelling is so great. Of course, you can do nonfiction books. I mean, we still read philosophy, we still read history books and biographies from the past. But I think the books that really do endure tend to be fiction. They tend to be Catcher in the Rye, or they tend to be Dickens, or whoever else it might be, because they're the universality of storytelling, that urge for people to tell stories and to hear stories told, is just so permanent inside of us that we are always willing to engage it.
Yeah, I agree with that, and it's actually something that I think people more on the left side have always been better at doing, which is using narratives, using stories. If you look at Hollywood, look at a lot of this. I was just thinking not too long ago, all the movies that I watched as I was growing up. I'm pretty sure the villain was this evil, rich, greedy capitalist. I'm pretty sure. I had no idea, but I'm pretty sure that was the villain in every single movie that I ever watched. Now, they didn't have to do a documentary about how the evil, rich, greedy capitalist was the villain in all of our lives. I just had to watch a story over and over again about that, and then eventually that gets kind of implanted in your mind. I think it becomes part of your psyche. Luckily, with me, it actually didn't. But the other thing, because I found this, I listened to a few episodes too. You've got a podcast as well, right? Burning Castle podcast.
Yeah, I do. I have conversations with people who are creators, whether they are writers or designers, filmmakers, but they are sort of looking around, seeing that the world is caught in chaos. It's a very chaotic moment for us, and they're trying to understand how what they do creatively can have an impact on this chaotic world and make things better for their audiences, generally for the world, and also for themselves. To stay oriented in a very strange time and use creative work to do that. I think that's a very powerful thing to do, and I think it's a gift that you give to yourself, and that hopefully you give to others as well.
Yeah, I really, really love the idea of that podcast. I'm going to make sure I put a link to it in here because really, if all of us can take the responsibility on ourselves to change these things, we all live in this burning, this chaotic, crazy world right now. But if each one of us takes the responsibility on to fix that, then you can actually change the world by doing that. So I think it's a really great message with the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's, I'm observant Jewish person, and that's a very core idea in our tradition, which is that we are all responsible for each other. You don't look around the world and be like, that's not my problem. You look around the world and say, that is my problem, and I need to figure out how I can make a difference. Doesn't mean you need to go out and give up all your possessions and, live on a mountaintop and meditate for humanity. It means you need to think about what is uniquely yours to give. It could be so simple. Maybe you're a great skateboarder and can teach a bunch of kids how to skateboard today, or help a neighbor who's older, or any number of things that you can do. And I think that's the real message. And with the creators on the Burning Castle, these are people who know how to create music or make films or art or design or whatever. And they do that they do that faithfully. They do that with an intent to do good and to do well. And I think that's the great thing.
That's great. Well, Ashley, I really appreciate your time today. Great conversation, and highly recommend that everyone goes out there and picks up the book.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation, and hopefully we'll do it again.